And I think as explorers and even scientists and conservationists, we often go to these rural areas and to these indigenous communities and we romanticize like, oh, they must, have this sense of animal husbandry or know how to coexist with the planet and the power to seed. And a lot of it is true, right? Like indigenous knowledge is incredibly important in a time like this when we're looking at a planet that's sort of out of balance and we just keep throwing more machines and money to try to fix it.
This is Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and I'm your host, Richard Wiese. Scratch the surface of an explorer and you'll find an adventure and a great story. This show is about their tales. This podcast is a proud supporter of the Explorers Club and the EC50 Initiative, 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about. For more information, go to explorers.org. One of my favorite movies is The Devil Wears Prada. And if you saw the movie, you may recall there's a scene with Meryl Streep. She explains to Anne Hathaway how a simple blue, what she called frumpy sweater, traces back to a long chain of creativity and culture. It's kind of a reminder that everyday things have deeper stories. So you may ask, what does this have to do with exploration? Well, that is a good question. Well, if you think of anthropology, one of the most defining features of a culture is the clothes that people wear. I'm probably wearing a gray version of that same frumpy sweater. Well, our guest today, Rebecca Hui, takes this idea further. As the founder of Rurban Studio, she connects indigenous artists with global markets, turning into many cases was unfair use of traditions into collaboration. I think the term you may hear all the time is called cultural misappropriation. Her work ensures that traditions are preserved, creators are celebrated, and stories are shared with respect and equity. Please join me in welcoming someone who is redefining what it means to be an explorer. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everyone.
Hey, Rebecca. So do you often get sort of mentioned in the same sort of paragraph as Meryl Streep?
Not really. That's flattering. I'm a fan of hers, but thank you for that introduction. I've never had that.
So, we talked about that whole idea of cultural misappropriation. And I think that for many years, the tradition of exploration was you'd go someplace unique, maybe you go to India or China, you see something that's interesting and you bring it back. And so, that's been going on for eons. And I think you have taken a different route on that whole idea of taking designs or taking things back and then sort of using it in a commercial sense.
Yeah. So my organization, we're called Rurban Studio, but actually as of this year, we're going to be called Rurban Studio. And I'll explain exactly why this word Rurban, which is really about this collision between rural and urban, this idea of how global villages and city streets can collide. Essentially our one-liner is that we are a organization that connects communities globally with rich cultural traditions from around the world. And we create ways for them to showcase their artwork and create the structures of equity and compensation and technology and IP so that in the cultural industries like fashion, they're able to work collaboratively with these cultures and communities.
So how does this work? In the past, would a big sort of design studio go to some place like China or India, see a pattern and say, wow, that would look really great on our fall collection? Kind of explain how this whole process, the Meryl Streep was talking about that whole chain of events of how a sweater becomes a sweater that you wear. How does that work in practical terms?
Yeah. So the way that fashion does it right now is just to kind of backtrack a little bit, because I moved to New York to really understand and unpack how this whole fashion and creative industry works. And so for any brand, any company that works in fashion, the way to stay ahead is relevance. They want to become culturally relevant, right? And that's why we always remember every generation by what they're wearing and how they look, right? So because brands know that, they try to stay ahead of that. And what they end up doing is saying, like, okay, in this world, what's going to be relevant? Like, what do people care about? If the clothes are essentially the ultimate signal of how people want to be perceived at, then we want to be as culturally relevant and forward as possible. So what happens is that the thing with fashion, though, nothing is actually ever original. It's always this recycling, like, tornado, essentially. So in this cycle, these brand designers, there's three ways that they decide their collections, right? One, they will go to these trade shows. Two, they'll do a lot of research. And then three, a lot of them actually will go out to some of these countries so that they can find inspiration. And when they go out there, it's really exciting, right? Like, it's really exciting that we see all these different cultures and art forms. And I think being inspired is a really beautiful thing. That's what makes us as humans glow and that's why art speaks to us. But what happens in the industry is that they'll take photos of those designs, put it on their mood board, and then, because they have to work very quickly, turn it into a collection. It ends up on the runway. And all of a sudden you have this high-end luxury brand in Paris having a runway collection where it's like, this is a look that was inspired from this country, but then the context of it is completely butchered. And then the communities actually see it on the runway and they're like, wait, this was a sacred tradition that my foremothers and fathers have had for generations. And it's like on a half-strung bikini with no respect or context. So that's sort of how it all happens. And we're trying to reverse this idea of just taking the artwork and the designs and the culture and making sure that the people who are creating it are part of the process, because it makes these collections better, right? And that's how you kind of reverse this misappropriation problem into celebration through these pillars of respect, reciprocity, and remuneration.
Our mission is to empower the next generation of explorers. If you like this podcast, please recommend it to a friend and have them join the expedition.
So in practical terms, and I know this because I know you, is that you do a lot of work in China, and that you go to villages and you somehow create not a marketing, but you create a collaboration between a village so they have input onto this. And so let me ask you this. When you go to a village, are they leery of you? Do they trust you? I mean, how does this process? Is it 3 cups of tea? How do you make people think, who is this woman?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to back up. I can talk about sort of the practical aspects of how we do it now. So I'll get to that last. But just to start off with, right, people are like, how did you start doing this? Like, how do you build trust? And what took you on this journey with this very specific model? And so I was digging through some of my journals from more than a decade ago. And these were actually journals from when I was first in these communities. And in a past life, I was actually a conservationist. I was on a Fulbright Nat Geo grant looking at human and animal conflict and coexistence in India. It was in this time period where I was studying from a lot of different communities in terms of how they coexisted with animals and the planet and what were traditional ways of doing so. And I think as explorers and even scientists and conservationists, we often go to these rural areas and to these indigenous communities and we romanticize like, oh, they must, have this sense of animal husbandry or know how to coexist with the planet and the power to seed. And a lot of it is true, right? Like indigenous knowledge is incredibly important in a time like this when we're looking at a planet that's sort of out of balance and we just keep throwing more machines and money to try to fix it when that's not really going to be the solution. So indigenous knowledge and storytelling is actually incredibly important. But what I saw when I was living and working with these communities, so this was back in West Bengal in 2014. In 2014. And what I saw was the boldness was certainly in their traditional music, their traditional textiles, their dance. But even though their practice was inherently creative and artistic, most of their parents or like the elderly generation didn't want the new generation to go into any of these practices. These cultures and traditions that we from the outside are like, wow, they're so beautiful and precious. They wanted them to leave and learn things like English, technology, and math, because that's been told to them that that's what's going to help them have a better future. And so you see a lot of these kids go into these urban areas, try to aspire for a better way of life, and then they end up losing their languages and their traditions. And I thought that that was such a tragedy, because when I come out back to places like New York, even though it's an amazingly inspiring place, we're all looking for identity, authenticity, and meaning. So throughout the years after having that encounter, and I was actually jumping between the US and in India, I was like, there's very few things in my heart that I felt like I could really be attached to and made me feel really alive than in the years where I was living with these communities. And I was like, I think they hold the answers and the treasure to the earth, but let's be really practical about it, right? It needs to make money because that's part of the reality. Two, they don't appreciate their own culture because everyone around them tells them that they're backwards, that this is primitive, that this is not the future. So, and then three, like the supply chains to get from where these villages are and where these art forms are to these markets in the global market is not efficient at all. So taking those three things into consideration, I started Rurban Studio, and started to meet all of these different artists and communities from starting with India, and having leaders from each community explain their traditions, their cultures, all these forms that wouldn't be considered art that you would see at Christie's or Sotheby's. And I'm like, you know what? There's value in this. Let's contextualize this and curate it in a way so that we can, in some ways, arbitrage and shortcut how far that distance is and figure out a model in the same way that Getty Images created for copyright systems for photographers. And let's do that for these communities and artists.
That's pretty advanced thinking for someone who was young. I guess everybody's got a journey. And so your journey began, I know, in Arizona. What was it like where you grew up, your parents, and how did it lead you there? What was your family like?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, sometimes when I link, when we think about why we do what we do, which requires a lot of conviction and waking up every single day to say, like, this is the best thing I could be doing with my life, and therefore I'm going to pour the next 12 hours of my energy into, it comes back down to your why. And oftentimes when you're connecting your why, it's a makeup of your upbringing, your perspectives, and the experiences you had. So I grew up all over the place. I was born in the US, but then I moved to Hong Kong when I was 4. Moved a bunch around across Asia then. And then I moved to a small, rural, now suburban town in Arizona, where it was so small that the context for how small it was that my nickname was Asia, because I was the only kid from the continent there. So that's what the kids called me. And it was really interesting because I think as a 9-year-old, I just came from Hong Kong and I had to constantly defend what was in my lunchbox. And it was a really interesting show and tell.
What was in your lunchbox?
Sometimes I would have, we have something called, what went well was zhongzi, which is it's like a sticky rice wrapped with lotus leaf. And that went really well. Like, oh, that's really, really interesting. That's really, really cool. The kids thought it was cool. But then it was funny. The day after, my mom packed me sushi, and the kids looked into the lunchbox and started screaming. They were like, ew, it's raw fish. And it's so funny because it's like, what, what third graders respond to is just hilarious in terms of what they think is cool and what's not cool.
Yeah, but nowadays sushi is, because I live in an affluent area of Connecticut, and I see little kids with their chopsticks having sushi and roe, and it's not so icky anymore. Maybe your parents were trendsetters.
Oh yeah, I know, right? I mean, same with chai, right? Like I have South Asian friends who are like, no one thought chai was cool or any of my samosas. And now like this whole industry is like chai is a high-end food. And that's where a little bit of that like misappropriation and question and resentment comes from, right? And the thing is like sharing should be a cool thing, like sharing our culture, but it's just really about like the context in which we bridge equity. And so I think a thing that I really thought about as a kid and something that made me confused as a kid was, so after the sushi day, I remember I went home and I told my mom, do not ever pack me any like food like that's not blueberry bagels or Lunchables. Like that's the thing that everyone else packed.
Wow.
And so my mom was like, I don't understand, but I only had blueberry bagels with cream cheese and Lunchables from
Man,
that.
I'd rather have the sushi. But Rebecca, one of your defining qualities, I think, is you have an electric smile. I mean, when people meet you, no, you have a big smile. You're very friendly. And I've seen you out in public, and it seems like all these young women want to be your friend or work for you. I've heard that more people than not, they want to work with you. Was that winning personality what got you through there, or is that something that evolved?
Well, thank you that you think that.
No, I do. Anybody who's watching this just notices that you're so quick with your smile, and that people always say the same thing. I like that girl.
Oh, well, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Um, yeah, it was weird because in Arizona, those days were tough. They were tough in a way that I often don't talk about. I think as an entrepreneur and as a full-grown adult woman, right, there's a lot of challenges with being an entrepreneur in the sense of the work that we do as well, right? Like I can talk on and on about like what it's like to like translate this work and bridge all these cultures and living between like trying to grow this organization between the worlds of, investments and all these things that I deal with to a day-to-day basis. But kind of going back to some of the hardest points, right? Like the moments that I think make you I didn't think I was cool at all growing up, right? I became so aware of what was cool and what was not cool, right? And of course the lunchbox example was just that starting point. When I started to become a teenager, it was really apparent as teenagers we all sort of kind of become confident and completely insecure, but it's a confident farce, right? It's sort of this like, who am I? Where do I belong? What is my identity? And I think as girls becoming women, it's one of the most just grueling transitions that people never talk about. That transition from like 11 to 16 or 17. And
I have a 16-year-old daughter.
yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you can see firsthand what that situation is like. And I think my experience was particularly unique because I was becoming a woman in an area where the identity perception was so harsh around how you looked and what you wore. And these are things that I think no girl really actually they don't think about as much before they're 10, right? Like we're out there like digging in sandboxes and like making teddy bears out of mud, playing with Legos, making stop motion films, playing chess. And then all of a sudden, like when you're 13, you start to realize like, you go to the girls' bathroom and I just remember like girls are just like spraying hair straighteners into the bathroom. And I remember like I was not considered in that definition, like someone who was cool, who looked good in that definition, whose smile was good, especially because I had a bit of like a speaking issue, right? Like I had when we were growing, like we're just sort of awkward. And so I remember just from like on an eighth grade point, I was in the chess club, but I quit because I was the only girl in the chess club. I also would go into school, and then like a lot of the guys will just like mimic the way that I looked and smiled. And I remember going home and looking to the mirror and just being like, I can't change the way I look, but I just want to like smash it. And there was no way I could change that. I would just go back when my mom picked me up from school, and I couldn't articulate what it felt like to be caged inside a body that wasn't my own, but was judged by others as not beautiful. So I never smiled. I felt really awkward, and I developed a very keen observation of who was cool and who was beautiful, and tried so hard to be like, I don't want to be made fun of. Like most of the days, I would just spend it sitting in the orchestra room doing my chemistry homework, and I didn't want to like be outside because it just felt scary. Yeah.
Rebecca, but you've gone into an industry that's probably is as catty as any girls' bathroom in high school. I mean, fashion is really about appearance, being cool. You mentioned that you're a CEO. I mean, I'm sure there's, because you're still very young and young looking, that people, meet you and they go, well, we'd like to speak to the CEO or the boss.
Yeah, it's funny. And then I show up, right? It's so funny because it is very catty. And to be quite honest, fashion is kind of stupid for most of the part. Like people are like, do you have a fashion background? Absolutely not. I studied architecture, urban design, and planning and business, right? So, and then spent most of my life like working in India and studying rural and urban dynamics. So when I came into fashion, it was really bizarre because it was like the look, the vibes, like who's cool, who isn't, right? It is the ultimate cool kids, or trying to define its own ultimate cool kids club. But fashion is like that teenage girls' bathroom before you go out and like end up having to see the gaze of, everyone. And so the reason why I went into fashion is because when I started Root Studio, there was a particular moment where there was actually right before Root Studio. This is sort of the transition moment where I remember being in this village and I was drawing this traditional house. And then a 18-year-old kid comes up to me and he was like, hey, can I have your pen that you're drawing with? And I was like, why? And he's like, cause it's cool. And I look at my pen, it's a pen that says Google. And it was from a career fair that I had like not too long ago from college. And I was like, Google's not cool at all. And then like, it struck me that coolness is something that's really important because of the way that we construct our identity. And he was like, I'll give you my bracelet in exchange for your Google pen. And I'm like, your bracelet's so beautiful. It's made out of seeds. It's all like hand carved. It looked like it had so much intergenerational presence to it. And I was like, okay, wait, this is really, really weird, right? Like coolness is an industry that these fashion brands build billions and billions of dollars around. And what is it built on? Like what values and what identity, right? And like coolness can be used as a metric to include or exclude. So I was like, you know what? If Supreme, the skatewear brand, can build a $2 billion business on this arbitrary idea of what's cool, like, can we subvert that towards communities and people who are actually really cool and what's like cool that's inside?
Rebecca, this has been going on since caveman. I'm sure there was somebody who was showing off their mammoth wardrobe, fur, and someone was snickering. That's not real mammoth. There's mastodon in there. I'm just saying is there's always been, and I think, especially in New York, because I lived there for so many years, come fall and winter, especially, man, people are wearing their either wealth or their status on their backs. You don't see it as much in the summer, though. I'm sure there's some accessories that, go beyond my scope of knowing what's cool. But, this is as universal, right? Every village, everywhere, someone's admiring what somebody's wearing. So, I guess going back to that whole idea of anthropology, do you feel that you are an anthropologist?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think part of being that kid who was always looking in between cultures and trying to figure out what were the cool kids doing, right? That insecurity sort of transformed into a lifelong curiosity of being able to see other cultures and being like, when I see people, I can see like just admiring what makes them who they are, the unique pieces of how their upbringing, their culture, their identity, their vibe, their energy. And like that is cool. Like that inherent, like whoever that core is, like that's so important to just acknowledge and celebrate and to share that. And I think when we try to, I was drawing this comic the other day, which is like a grape is not a lychee. And when a lychee, which is a fruit that I eat a lot, a lychee is not a grape. And when a lychee tries to become a grape, it becomes a crappy version of a grape. So lychee should be lychee and grape should be grape. And the same way, it's like, as an anthropologist, right? Like we can just celebrate how beautiful all these different cultures are around us and also acknowledge and have that reflect and teach us what these other cultures have and exchange that in an equitable way for us to not take from it or force it to be something else. But how can we actually join hands and celebrate it as a form of sharing, right? So that's
your journey is fascinating because I acknowledge that there was pain in there or feeling alienated, but if it's brought you to this place, then maybe it was a good thing. And let's face it, not every experience will have the same result on every person. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger in his autobiography was talking about having a very disciplinarian father, which made him grow, made his brother turn into an alcoholic and I think commit suicide. So, it's just an interesting, we just have a couple minutes. I have two last questions, really advice to a teenage girl. I have a 16-year-old. What's the advice?
Yeah. Well, maybe there's not advice to her just yet, but based on what you were saying, I really believe that suffering helps you to see. And the hardship, you don't tell this to someone while they're going through it. And so this is not what you tell someone who's going through something that's hard, but it does increase your empathy. And when you can see more, you actually become a fuller person with more creativity. But I think advice to a 16-year-old girl, yeah. Well, number one, don't date. It's a waste of time. That's that. It's a waste of time. That's my
Wow.
visceral reaction.
Wow, Rebecca, man, it's, just so people know, it's actually a Friday that we're recording this on, and the weekend in my house is all about where people are going.
Well, I'm just saying, like, there's always going to be time to date. It's not a rush. When you're a 16-year-old, like, even though that seems like that's the thing to do and hormones are racing or whatever, like, no. Like, it doesn't matter. It matters to just try to, even though when you're a 16-year-old girl, like everything I'm probably saying right now or what you say to your daughter probably won't land in the same way because there's a bunch of other things that are competing from that, from what you're trying to tell them. Like, it doesn't matter. And to them, like, it matters. Like, all of that matters. And just for them to maybe know that, like, inside the core of all the different things that might be making them anxious, to know that, like, who exactly they are, that core identity, like, just shut off Instagram, shut off TikTok, and be like, I am generative, I am full, I am beautiful. And if I just give myself that identity to blossom and be beautiful, I am going to always have more to give, and I'm going to be abundant, and I'm going to be content. So, yeah.
Rebecca, I admittedly, have progressed to, I really know that I'm not cool, and that's okay.
No.
But you are cool. And before you say no, I'm going to come around to what I said a little earlier. It seems like every young professional woman that I know that has met you has said that, wow, either they want to be like you or they want to go work for you. I've never met a person that people say, I would like to work for her. I could tell them they'll make $5 an hour and they're like, I don't care. I want to. So I don't know if fashion doesn't,
that, by the way.
if fashion doesn't work out, maybe cult leader does. So Rebecca, thank you for taking us on this journey. Honestly, I know it's been a tough journey, but man, you are tougher.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I have an infinite resource that's bigger than me. So I'm grateful.
All right. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you, Richard.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast. Now we have a little favor to ask. We'd really appreciate your support, so make sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss another episode. See you out on the trail.